All right, so you have now drilled. You have holes here and you have holes here, okay? The next thing you need to do is you need to take a pad sander. You're gonna stay right there. I'm gonna walk over here. Take a pad sander and sand everything. You're gonna sand all your edges, all your surfaces, all three of your pieces, including your letter or your symbol or whatever it is. Everything gets completely sanded at this point because it is so much easier to sand your pieces than to sand your entire board. You will be sanding your entire board later, but you're gonna start out by sanding everything so that it's done early. Okay, so my example board that I'm working with is not sanded, but just keep in mind that you need to sand your work first. First thing I had this student do was to cut some dowels. So these are about 1 inch long dowels. They are long enough, your holes are deep enough that this is definitely going to be able to fit in here. If these dowels are too long and your holes are too short, then you won't be able to close this thing up and it will be a problem later. So you got to make sure these things should be like a 1/2 inch deep. The holes should be about a 1/2 inch deep. Your dowels should be about 1 inch deep so that in the end it will definitely fit. And you can drill a little deeper. It doesn't matter if there's extra hole in there, okay? It just matters whether or not this thing gets lost inside there. All right, so we've got our foot. We've got our board. We're gonna take some glue, which I'll have around the room. Put a bead of glue across that whole surface like that. Take your dowel, roll it in there. Stay right there. Put that in. Now this brings up the notion of what's called water pressure, which is an issue. Because if this thing's really tight, which it probably is, it's gonna take some effort to get that to go down into it. And I just split my board, so you gotta be careful about that. You don't wanna put glue inside here. In fact, I should have remembered that. Don't put glue down into the holes, although it's probably good to have this in the video because some of you will make this mistake. Do not put glue down in the holes, because if I didn't have glue in there, I wouldn't be having the trouble I'm having right now. Okay, I'm trying to clear out most of the glue before I put that in there. Now I'm going to take this thing. I want you to recognize, you should have checked this ahead of time, or I should have checked ahead to make sure they line up. Because if these things don't line up, you got to stop, come see Mr. Olson, he'll get you straightened out. But if it does line up, you got to recognize that if you didn't drill it perfectly, it might be different here versus here. So you want to check both directions and make sure you're lining it up in a way that is going to line up properly. On your rubric, it's going to talk about whether or not your foot is centered. Sometimes people glue these things up too quickly and their foot's off center this direction. Okay, so you got to make sure that it's going to line up properly. Now, I'm going to put this in a vise, close it up, and tighten it down. Excellent secondary example. I think the dowel's a little longer than my holes. It's not quite closing up right there. So that would also cause you a problem because there's a gap. That's what that's called. Just stay right there. I'll be there in a moment. It is extremely important at this point that you clean up this glue. And you want to do so quickly. Like right after you put it together, you do not want to leave glue residue there because it is so much easier to clean that than to try to sand it later. In fact, if you try to sand it later, it's going to be a giant mess. It's going to look really bad. So you need to clean up this glue right away. Do a really thorough job. Get a paper towel, clean it up, get it closed up. What that's about, something in there. Don't actually know what that is. Actually, it's a bit of a dowel, I think. You want to clean that up before you walk away. Put this back in here. I'm going to take my letter and I'm going to decide, or symbol, and I'm going to decide whether I want it to go this way or this way. Okay, if it's a letter of the alphabet, you got to decide which way you're going to be able to read it from. I'm basically going to put glue in here, and I'm going to find some way to clamp this thing well so that it stays put. This is also your last opportunity to kind of square this up. So depending on how you put your clamps, you could actually adjust it to make it more or less square. So this is the moment where you're gonna clamp it. You're gonna try to make sure it's nice and square. You should probably have checked this before you even started this process to make sure you're gonna be able to clamp it squarely, because that is also on your rubric, whether or not your letter is square, whether there are gaps. These are things you probably wanna look at before you start gluing this whole thing up, because at this point, you got glue all over everything and you start putting it together and it's sitting like this. Probably should just wipe everything down and recut it. But one way or the other, you're gonna glue this thing in place like this, put some clamps on it, and let it dry till tomorrow.